The steel doors of the Blackwood Psychiatric wing slid shut with a final, hollow resonance that echoed through the empty atrium. Amy Brenner stepped into the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, unaware that the facility had already begun to betray its own history. The ward was designed to be a fortress of recovery, yet beneath the surface, the architecture harbored secrets that defied the laws of the institution. She arrived for her overnight rotation, expecting only the routine of medication rounds and patient logs. Instead, she entered a silent, pressurized environment where the silence felt deliberate. By the time the moon hung high over the perimeter fence, the ward held a secret that defied every medical protocol she had studied. A single chart lay abandoned on the nurse's station, its handwriting a jagged, unfamiliar script that did not belong to any member of the night staff. The air in the facility felt thick with the residue of a life that had been systematically erased. Welcome to Swasti Diaries. We are looking back at the night when the boundary between patient care and calculated erasure collapsed. The investigation revealed that the ward's security was not just bypassed. It was exploited from within by someone who understood the building's hidden veins. But the most unsettling discovery was not what was missing. It was the phantom presence left behind in the logs. How did an unauthorized visitor navigate a locked, high-security wing without triggering a single alarm? The truth began with a discarded badge found in the ventilation crawlspace, a piece of plastic that should have been incinerated years ago. The air inside Ward D did not circulate like the rest of the facility. It possessed a stagnant, pressurized quality, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Amy Brenner walked the perimeter of the psychiatric wing, her footsteps muffled by the industrial carpet, yet the silence felt loud, punctuated by the rhythmic, distant hum of the climate control system. She arrived with the intention of completing her routine logs, but the environment immediately challenged her presence. The facility was designed as a closed loop, a fortress of recovery where every patient and staff member occupied a specific tracked coordinate. Yet, as she moved through the dim, fluorescent-lit corridors, the rigidity of the ward began to fray. She recalled the head nurse's instructions: never leave the secure perimeter, never deviate from the shift timeline, as if those mandates were the only things keeping the chaos at bay. The atmosphere was thick with a synthetic, sterile scent that masked something far more putrid. It was not just the isolation. It was the realization that the ward's security was merely a facade. Looking back, the shift was never intended to be routine. When she reached the medication station, she discovered the first crack in the institution's armor. A logbook left open, the ink still tacky, documenting dosages for a patient who had been officially discharged 3 days prior. The discrepancy was not a clerical error. It was a deliberate, calculated insertion. She stood in the center of the station, the fluorescent light flickering above her, and wondered how many ghosts were currently walking the halls of a building that claimed to be sealed. The patient, assigned to room 402, lay perfectly still, yet the clinical picture collapsed under scrutiny. According to the vitals monitor, the heart rate had plummeted into a terminal rhythm at precisely 3:14 a.m., a time that defied the established medication cycle. I examined the chart, my fingers tracing the lines of the entry. The handwriting was elegant, almost practiced, yet it lacked the erratic tremor typical of the night nurse on duty. Beneath the ink, a faint indentation revealed a different pressure, as if someone had traced the letters over an original record. This was not a natural decline. It was a choreography of biological interference. I turned to the bedside cabinet, finding the drawer slightly ajar, a breach of the strict sterile protocol. Inside, a small glass vial sat discarded, its label wiped clean of any identifying chemical markers. The air in the room felt heavy, stripped of the usual antiseptic scent and replaced by a sharp metallic tang. Looking closer at the floor, I noticed a series of fine, gray dust deposits trailing from the ventilation grate near the ceiling toward the base of the bed. The security system had logged no door entries for 6 hours, meaning the intruder had bypassed the perimeter entirely. The impossibility of the situation settled in my gut. If no one entered through the door, and the logs were falsified by a phantom hand, the ward was not a sanctuary. It was a hunting ground. The discrepancy between the official time of death and the physiological state of the patient confirmed my suspicion. The murder was a calculated, pre-planned execution masked as a routine failure. The hallway light flickered with a rhythmic dying buzz, casting long erratic shadows over the floorboards. I navigated toward the restricted medical cabinet, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The lock, usually secure, hung slightly off-center, a subtle mechanical failure that screamed of recent interference. Upon opening the cabinet, the inventory logs lay exposed, their pages flipped to a section that should have remained untouched for the weekend. The entries were a mess of calculated deception. Someone had meticulously erased the original dosage records and overwritten them with false figures, mimicking the handwriting of the head nurse with chilling precision. It was not a mistake. It was an audit trail designed to mislead. As I cross-referenced the altered logs with the patient's chart, a pattern emerged. The drugs recorded as administered did not match the biological reality of the body in room 402. This was no simple error or oversight by a tired staff member. This was a deliberate, clinical redirection of evidence. I found a set of master keys discarded near the base of the cabinet, their metal surface cold and devoid of prints. The keys did not belong to the floor staff. They were older, heavier, and carried the wear of a bygone era in the facility's history. Someone possessed intimate knowledge of these security protocols, someone who knew exactly which logs to alter to mask the lethal dose. The question was no longer how they entered the room, but who had the clearance to rewrite the history of this ward. I stared at the keys, realizing that the intruder was not merely a phantom, they were an architect of this silence. The keys were a lie. As I stood in the heavy, stagnant air of the corridor, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The keys were not the primary entry tool, but a calculated misdirection left to be discovered. I knelt near the base of the cabinet, my light catching a sliver of plastic wedged into the floor's expansion joint. It was a visitor badge, laminated and worn, yet it bore no date or authorization stamp. The name on the card had been scratched away with a sharp blade, leaving only the faint, jagged grooves of the plastic beneath. This person had never been logged into the front desk registry. They had bypassed the facility's security perimeter entirely. The ward was not an impenetrable fortress, but a sieve. If someone could move through the ventilation shafts or maintenance tunnels, the very arteries of this building, then the entire medical record was compromised. I felt the weight of the silence around me. Every shadow in the hallway suddenly seemed to pulse with potential movement. The intruder had not just accessed the medicine, they had been living within the walls, watching the staff's rotations, learning the exact rhythm of the head nurse's rounds. My pulse quickened as I traced the edge of the badge with my gaze. The perpetrator was still somewhere in this structure, hiding in the dark, waiting for the facility to settle back into its uneasy, artificial peace. The investigation had just shifted from a simple medical error to a hunt within a labyrinth. The deeper I dug into the staff rotations, the more the facility's veneer of order began to fracture. It was not merely about who possessed the keys. It was about the quiet, festering resentment that simmered beneath the surface of every shift change. I analyzed the duty logs from the night of the incident, comparing them against the pharmacy cabinet access times. 3 names surfaced repeatedly during the critical window. Nurse Elena stood out, not for her presence, but for the jarring inconsistency in her documentation. Her charts were meticulous, almost clinical, yet I found a series of entries where the handwriting deviated. A slight, forced slant that suggested someone was mimicking her style. When I questioned her about the head physician's recent policy shifts, she deflected with a practiced ease, though her eyes betrayed a deep-seated, long-standing grudge. She spoke of the head physician's obsession with cost-cutting, a move that had stripped the ward of necessary oversight. It was a classic case of professional sabotage, yet the mechanics of the crime suggested something more calculated than a mere grudge. The cabinet logs showed that someone had accessed the controlled substances using a bypass code that had supposedly been retired months ago. This was not the work of a disgruntled employee acting on impulse. It was the work of an insider who understood the architecture of our failure. The trail led away from the nursing station and toward the maintenance tunnels, where the air was thick with dust and the silence was absolute. I realized then that I was not looking for a murderer among the staff. I was looking for someone who had effectively erased themselves from the roster entirely. The facility suddenly plunged into darkness as the localized power failure severed the connection to the external world. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hum of the emergency backup generators. I sat at my desk, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and re-examined the surveillance logs I had pulled from the server room. A contradiction stared back at me. The nursing station log showed Nurse Elena accessed the cabinet at 2:14 a.m., yet the secondary digital surveillance, encrypted and hidden from the standard administrative view, recorded no movement in that hallway during the entire hour. Someone had manipulated the logs to frame her, creating a digital ghost where there should have been a human presence. My pulse quickened as I realized the implications. This was not merely an act of professional sabotage by a disgruntled employee. The precision required to bypass the secondary server suggested a level of clearance that no nurse, head physician, or janitor possessed. I looked toward the maintenance access panel, which remained slightly ajar, its hinges showing fresh, metallic shavings that glittered in the low light. The perpetrator had not just bypassed the security. They had utilized the building itself as a weapon, moving through the ventilation network like a phantom. I checked the visitor badge I recovered earlier, comparing the ink smudges to the forgery on the patient charts. They matched perfectly. My suspicion shifted from the living, breathing staff to a history that had been buried within these walls. If the logs were a lie, then the entire timeline of the patient's decline was a manufactured reality, constructed by someone who knew exactly how to dismantle the truth from the inside out. The discovery of the hidden ventilation system changed everything. Looking back at those hours in the dark, the pieces of the puzzle no longer fit a simple narrative of an internal power struggle. I realized the perpetrator did not break into the ward. They were already there, integrated into the architecture of the facility itself. The metallic shavings near the access panel were not the result of a forced entry, but evidence of repeated, long-term maintenance of the tunnel's locking mechanism. My analysis of the forged patient charts revealed a disturbing level of patience. The handwriting was not merely a clumsy imitation. It was a precise, calculated recreation of nursing logs spanning months. Every signature, every medication dosage, and every shift change had been meticulously fabricated to create a false history of the patient's deteriorating condition. It was a phantom existence, sustained by someone who understood the clinical rhythms of the ward better than the staff on duty. The discarded visitor badge was merely a decoy, a clumsy breadcrumb left to draw my eyes toward the entrance while the real path remained concealed behind the drywall. I stared at the ventilation shaft, the darkness within appearing as a throat that had swallowed the truth. The realization hit me with cold, crystalline clarity. I was not chasing a murderer who had slipped past the guards, but a ghost who had lived among the patients, hiding in plain sight behind the very walls that were supposed to provide security. The investigation had moved beyond individual guilt. It was now a hunt for an architect of deception. The discovery of the hidden ventilation system led me to Nurse Elena's private locker, tucked away in the deepest corner of the staff quarters. The air in that room felt stale, heavy with the scent of floor wax and old secrets. Inside, behind a stack of moth-eaten uniforms, I found a locked metal box. The key, which I had retrieved from the wall cavity earlier, turned the rusted lock with a sharp mechanical click. Inside lay more than just personal effects. There were financial ledgers dating back 5 years. These were not the records of a simple nurse, but the meticulous bookkeeping of an architect of fraud. The entries detailed massive, recurring payments from a pharmaceutical shell company, linked directly to the supply of counterfeit medications that had been circulating through the ward. The motive was never about madness or simple revenge. It was a cold, calculated preservation of a dying reputation. The former doctor, the phantom I was tracking, had used the ward as a testing ground for experimental drug trials, and Elena had been his silent, paid accomplice. She didn't kill to protect a patient. She killed to protect the silence. The ledger showed a final, desperate transfer scheduled for the night of the murder, a payout that would have secured their escape. I stared at the ledger, the ink still crisp despite the years, and realized the victim had discovered these shipments. He was not a random target. He was the witness who had finally deciphered the inventory logs. The realization left me paralyzed. The killer was not just hiding in the vents, he was buying his way out of a lifelong sentence for malpractice. I walked toward the storage room, convinced that the trail of breadcrumbs led directly to Nurse Elena. The ledger sat heavy in my pocket, a testament to her greed. I reached the door, expecting to find her huddled over her illicit files, perhaps even preparing for a final getaway. I pushed the door open, ready to confront the architect of this fraud. The room was empty of life. Elena lay sprawled behind a stack of industrial crates, unconscious and bruised, her breathing shallow and ragged. She had been discarded like refuse, a pawn who had outlived her usefulness. My theory crumbled in an instant. If Elena was the victim of a violent encounter, then she was not the mastermind I had been tracking. A smear of industrial lubricant on the floor near her hand caught the sliver of moonlight filtering through the high reinforced window. It was the same thick synthetic grease I had observed earlier on the rusted hinges of the ventilation shaft. My eyes tracked the trail. It didn't lead toward the exit, but upward toward the ceiling panels. A single heavy-duty surgical scalpel lay discarded in the corner, its blade wiped clean but showing a microscopic chip in the steel near the hilt. This was the weapon. It was not a tool of medical necessity, but a precise instrument of execution. I realized then that the killer was still watching me from above, hidden in the labyrinth of the facility's bones. The nurse was merely a witness who had nearly been silenced, and the true phantom was closer than I dared to imagine. The handwriting on the chart was a ghost from a buried past. I studied the loops of the letters, the sharp, downward pressure on the T's, and the distinct upward slant of the terminal Y's. This was not the work of a distracted nurse or a tired doctor. It was the precise practice script of a surgeon, someone who had spent decades detailing incisions and documenting complex medical procedures. My mind raced back to the psychiatric ward's history, specifically the personnel files from 5 years prior. A lead physician, Dr. Eris Thorne, had vanished following an investigation into systemic malpractice and missing pharmaceutical stocks. The handwriting matched his signature perfectly. The realization hit me with the weight of cold iron. The imposter was not a patient who had wandered in. He was the architect of his own disappearance, hiding within the very walls he once governed. He had used the ventilation tunnels to bypass security, moving like a phantom between the patient rooms and the storage vaults. The altered inventory logs were his way of correcting the failures that had cost him his career, a desperate, meticulous attempt to rewrite history. I looked at the scalpel again, noting the surgical precision of the chip. It was a tool of his trade, a relic of a life he refused to abandon. But if he had been living inside the walls, he needed a staging area, a place where he could monitor the facility without being seen. The trail of lubricant led directly to a maintenance hatch behind the main medical library, a location I had previously dismissed as a dead end. Looking back at the timeline, the precision of the infiltration became terrifyingly clear. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the facility's secondary power grid flickered. A planned surge triggered from the basement maintenance panel. It was not a malfunction. It was a tactical blackout designed to blind the night shift security cameras for exactly 90 seconds. During this window of absolute darkness, the perpetrator moved through the ventilation network, his knowledge of the floor plan allowing him to bypass the heavy steel doors that separated the high-security wing from the general wards. He utilized the crawlspace to descend directly into the medicine storage room. I mapped the path by the faint scuff marks left on the interior of the shafts, where the metal had been worn thin by repeated friction. He did not rush. He knew the patrol routes because he had once dictated them. He reached the cabinet, retrieved the specific dosages, and carefully replaced the inventory logs with forged pages that mimicked the exact ink density of the shift lead. The most chilling realization was the timing of his departure. He did not exit through the main doors. Instead, he retreated into the utility tunnel behind the library, sealing the hatch from the inside with a magnetic latch he had salvaged months prior. He was not merely hiding. He was operating within the facility as a parasite, feeding on the very records he was systematically erasing. The investigation into the malpractice case 5 years ago had been his motive, but the preservation of his own shadow was his method. Every piece of the puzzle now pointed to a man who had never truly left the building, but had simply changed his shape to survive within it. The realization did not arrive with a bang, but with the quiet, sickening click of a lock turning in my own mind. I had been studying the patient records for weeks, convinced I was the hunter, tracing the steps of a ghost who navigated these walls like a spider in its web. But as I cross-referenced the shift logs from the night of the murder, I saw the pattern. My own arrival at this facility 3 months ago, the specific department I was assigned to, the mentor who chose me, the very files I was granted access to, none of it was random. The evidence was never meant to be found by the authorities. It was meant to be found by me. I was the perfect scapegoat, a medical student with a past mistake already hanging over my head, ready to be leveraged. The perpetrator had not just bypassed security. He had curated an environment where I would be the one to stumble upon the altered logs, effectively placing my fingerprints on the very evidence that would frame me for the systemic malpractice he was burying. He had been watching me from the ventilation shafts, waiting for the moment I would piece together the timeline, only to realize that my entire investigation was the final step of his cover-up. The trap was not set on the night of the murder. It was set the day I walked through those front doors. I was not the investigator. I was the final piece of the forensic debris he needed to clear away before he vanished for good. The air inside the maintenance shaft was stagnant, heavy with the scent of ozone and rotting insulation. I didn't need to see him to know he was there. The truth had finally coalesced into a singular, undeniable reality. He was not a patient or a staff member. He was Dr. Aris, a man whose medical license had been revoked 5 years prior, the same man whose signature appeared on the early, falsified audit reports I had dismissed as clerical errors. He had been living within the walls, utilizing the ventilation network to move between floors, carefully curating the evidence to point toward me. He had manipulated the drug dosages in the inventory logs to mirror the precise, erratic patterns of a novice, my patterns. Every time I had felt the thrill of a breakthrough, I was merely following the breadcrumbs he had laid to ensure the investigation led back to my own past errors. I found his makeshift workspace behind the library shelving unit, a cramped, dark corner lit only by a flickering emergency lamp. There, spread out like a macabre tapestry, were the original patient charts, the ones that had been officially marked as lost during the facility's migration to digital records. Beside them, a set of forged nursing credentials, the ink still tacky in the cool, damp air. He had orchestrated the murder of the patient, a man who had finally threatened to expose the systemic malpractice Aris had been hiding for years, and then he had used me as the final clean piece of the forensic puzzle. He was gone now, having slipped through the service hatch into the night, but he had left behind his most critical mistake. A single, customized surgical tool engraved with his own initials, hidden beneath the floorboards of his temporary sanctuary. The sirens arrived long after Dr. Aris had vanished into the labyrinth of the city, leaving behind only the cold, mechanical silence of Ward D. Looking back, the facility felt less like a hospital and more like a tomb for secrets that were never meant to surface. Every corridor, once a place of healing, stood exposed as a stage for a calculated, long-term deception. The inventory logs, the forged charts, and that single engraved tool were not just evidence. They were the physical manifestations of a man who had traded his morality for survival, hiding in the very walls that were supposed to contain him. My own career, threatened by the shadows of my past, was spared only by the sheer recklessness of his final act. I realized then that justice in these halls was rarely a clean affair. It was a messy, fragmented process of stitching together the truth from the debris of broken lives and hollow promises. The patient who died did not just lose his life. He lost his chance to be heard, silenced by a ghost who lived among us. As I walked out into the pre-dawn stillness, the weight of the investigation finally lifted, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The case was closed, but the memory of those dark, hidden tunnels remained. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of Ward D, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries.